So that's always going to be my inspiration when I'm trying to give you a sense of feel for where we are. So it was a lot of descriptions from sources that were back then, reading newspaper articles describing neighborhoods, and then actually going on Google Maps and Google Street Maps to see what's there now. And a lot of that stuff is still there. And you mentioned that turn earlier, that slow turn. That was completely, people can't believe it, but that's exactly what was going to happen.
That's crazy. And by the way, I love that. I did feel like your book had a really kind of gritty, noirish feel to it. I thought you did a tremendous job. I thought it was really like you really rooted the reader in the time and place. So I thought that was terrific.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I wrote down in that vein of sort of the noir feel. I wrote down some dialogue that I loved. You had some great lines. You were born beat. I love that. Or feathers make me sneeze, which was, and I forget what the preceding line was, but it was very witty, I thought. So, and I mean, the dialogue I thought was so punchy. I really liked it. How did you make it authentic? Like, how did you think? Did you think about how people talked back then, or how did it come to you?
Sure, that's one of the things I always strive for whenever I write. I always try to make it as authentic as I possibly can, because people don't always speak the same way that they do, like in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and all the way up to today. I mean, in our own lifetime, we've had a lot of slang come in and out of usage, and it's tough to keep track.
Yeah, my son's 13 years old, and it's like he talks a different language. I can't understand. It's like cringy, and I'm like, it's cringe-worthy. But anyhow, go on.
So I mean, it was a lot of reading of material that was back then. Reading if I'm going to a source material like quotes from a newspaper reporter, I'll see how did the people phrase that. Also watching movies that were written and produced in 63 through 65 to get a sense as to how modern language is used back then and the different inflections. So when I'm writing it in my mind and putting it on the page, I can give it that punch that it needs.
Yeah.
And I always try to make sure that my characters don't all sound the same. They might speak in similar patterns, but they can't all sound the same. One of my literary heroes, James Ellroy, great writer, great crime writer. He's awesome. My only critique of him is that each of his characters sounds exactly the same.
Oh, and interesting.
It's always, yeah, if you read it, and it breaks my heart because I love, but especially with his later books, you can take a female character and a male character and run their dialogue side by side. And you'll see that it's the same pattern. It's the same usage of words, the same terms. And it's, for me, that's one of those things that I find great inspiration from Ellroy, but I also use them as a magnet so that I don't get too close to that. So the dialogue comes from a lot of research and listening to people who spoke back then from primary sources like movies, newspapers, television stuff, things like that.
And I think your characters did all have distinctive voices. I didn't feel like they were at all uniform. So you mentioned this long, slow exit, like a bottleneck, essentially, which, I've spent a year in Baghdad, and that's like the one thing you want to avoid is a bottleneck because that's like 101, right? You're going to get bombed. And like at a checkpoint, for example. So, I mean, it's incredible when you're reading this story that they were so wedded to this kind of ridiculous plan. And was that just because it almost sounded like Kennedy was just adamant, determined to show his adoring fans was that what was going on, or why were they so wedded to this crazy plan?
I think that's what it was. I mean, you will have people, and there are people who can probably hear this who are going to scream at their screens right now, but there are people who think that there was a plot from within to set him up for something. And I don't think that was necessarily the case, like the people who came up with the motorcade plot, because a lot of people saw that route and they had to bless it. They saw it was acceptable for that time because Kennedy back then was in trouble. And that's not a Republican or Democrat thing. He was a little bit worried about his reelection chances in 64. He'd been embarrassed by the Russians. They tried to spin the Cuban Missile Crisis as a win, but a lot of people said it wasn't, that we backed down. There were a lot of people who said, go into Cuba, let them come into Western Germany, and we'll beat them. And now, in hindsight, if you look at that strategy, it probably would have worked that way. But, you know, in 63, he was in trouble. He knew he was going into a re-election campaign in 64. He was an incredibly photogenic president, and they wanted pictures of his adoring crowds of, you know, seeing him in public and making the inaccessible accessible. So it makes sense that he would have taken that route, so that they, and the Kennedy operation was great. They had it lined with people who were going to be supporters and come up with some great film. But, you know, that's the reason why it was. I don't think there was anybody scheming in the background saying, oh, well, we're going to do this and make him do this in a year. I think it was just sound political advice. And unfortunately, it helped the assassins.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I find so interesting, kind of the subtext of how far will you go for, you know, political gains, you know, to the point where you might be assassinated. I thought that was interesting. So you also mentioned, there's a brief mention of Diem's assassination in Vietnam.
Right.
And I thought that was interesting, and it reminded me of Tears of Autumn. Have you read that by Charles Perry?
Excellent. You're probably one of the few people I've ever talked to in this that has read that book. I've recommended it a bunch of times, but yes.
I love that book. I know it's like a sleeper book, right? It's like a sleeper classic. I mean, no, I feel like nobody's read that book. I love that you read it too.
Oh yeah, no, I love that, and that one kept me up nights afterwards. I was thinking, wow, that is possible, isn't it?
Right?
Wow.
Exactly. Yeah. So I thought that was sort of interesting that you kind of mentioned that. But there wasn't, it didn't seem like there was necessarily a nexus between the assassination plot you were describing and what was going on in Vietnam at the time.
Right. I wanted to include it because, you know, I think some people probably knew it was going to happen. If it was, I won't say renegade, but I mean, I think there were a cadre of people in the intelligence community who knew this stuff was going to happen. I don't think it was at the top. I don't think it was Dulles. Yeah. Like I said, I always hesitate to go for the men in the smoky room thing. It just, I'd never really seen it happen like that. And a lot of friends of mine who have been in such rooms said it doesn't happen like that either. They're usually talking about where they're going to go for dinner and you know, stuff like that. But I do think that there were probably some people who in the intelligence community who knew what was going to happen, and they talked to each other, and I think it was a loose configuration, but to directly tie the two, that would have been a little bit of a bridge too far. And when I'm writing something like this, whether it's a period piece or whether it's a modern day spy thriller, I always want to make sure I don't get to the point where the reader reads it and says, you know what, this is ridiculous, and then they put it aside. I'd rather have a less intricate plot and keep the reader engaged than try to swing for the fences and pop up to third base.
No, I thought your book was both believable and super readable. Like I was just 3 pages. So speaking of like Charles McCary and what do you think is the fascination? I feel like I was talking to my husband about this with Kennedy's assassination. I mean, it has spawned more conspiracy theories than anything I can think of.
Right.
I think is the obsession with this.
I think it's because whenever you take a look at this, and I mean a serious look at it, and there's always going to be something that flakes off, and you say, "Oh, well, what's underneath there?" And then you do it again, and for a while there, it grew stale. For about 10 years, everyone said, "Oh, it's just, you know, they made the JFK film, a lot of interesting stuff," but he made up a bunch of stuff there too. But that film ultimately got a lot of young researchers looking into this stuff, and when they did, lately, over the past 5 years or so, 10 years, you've seen a lot of the fruits of their research come to life. You know, they've dug down on the Payne family, for example, and I'm not going to get too much into the weeds. The family that Lee Harvey Oswald's wife was staying with. They said for years there's something wrong with that family, and they just sound like they're too innocent. Turns out, recent research has shown the Paynes had a long-standing relationship with the CIA. They were all employees of the CIA.
Whoa, interesting.
Yeah. Oh, and far in the field. She was a Quaker, but she was also a Quaker missionary. And and Ruth Paine got thrown out of a couple of countries because the real socialists were saying, you're trying to subvert our cause, get out. And that's documented. That's not somebody in their bathrobe coming up with that after a couple of Red Bulls. You can do research on it. And so that kind of stuff, I think, has gotten people to keep looking. I also think the Zapruder film has a lot to do with it too, because it's the actual assassination right there. And people, especially a lot of people on the spectrum, they love to sit there and pick things apart. And that film is ripe for that kind of stuff.
Did you see there's a book that came out recently by Mary Haverstick called The Woman I Know? And I haven't read it, but it's also a Kennedy assassination theory that I think a female spy was involved or something. I'm not sure.
Oh, but there have been a couple of, yeah. I mean, the one they said Oswald was down in Mexico, that he linked up with a female spy. And then there are people here. Lee and May was one where this chemist claimed she had an affair with Lee Harvey Oswald. You know, I don't think the guy was necessarily a genius, like a lot of people try to make him out to be, but he wasn't necessarily the schlub everybody makes him out to be either. I think he got manipulated. And I do think that he was pulled in a lot of different directions. So I'm not really sure about, how much of a mastermind he was, but he's definitely not the fool that everybody thinks. But that's the endearing thing about the mystery. I think that's why people keep coming back to this assassination, because people can just sense there's something off about this. And the more they do their own research, like a lot of the stuff I did for Chicago 63, I found a 1974 article from a local magazine that detailed all of this stuff. And I had already done all my research on this. And the reporter clicked it all off. And it was, he painted a very convincing picture. And that was back in 74. So that told me a lot of people have been talking about this for a long time. Just haven't heard it on the mainstream part of things.
So, so one of my questions, because you did all this amazing research, and you chose to make it a novella as opposed to a novel or even nonfiction. Do you consider nonfiction or a novel?
Nonfiction is something that really hasn't appealed to me yet. I think I would like to write a nonfiction book at some point, but for something like this, I wanted the latitude that a novel could give me, because if you write, especially in this space, if you write about anything about, anything about war, this stuff, or trains, if you're not incredibly specific and you get one detail wrong, people bring out the knives and they hack into you. I've seen that with my Westerns. God forbid I use the wrong term. Oh yeah, God forbid I use the wrong term or a gun that wasn't introduced until 6 months later. I will hear about it. And but it used to bother me, but then I said, you know what, these people are ultimately, they're not just our audience, they're consumers, and they have a right to complain when they see something that they don't agree with or they think is wrong. So for writing a fact-based book, I didn't want to be tied down to footnotes or making sure I got the dates exactly right. That's why the dates are a little vague, other than late October, early October, late December, November, early November. That way I kept it loose enough so that my feet weren't going to be held to the fire, and people didn't have an expectation of gospel. They knew they were being told a story. And I also I wanted to keep it as one hero, one protagonist, because in a story like this, too many cooks spoil the soup. So I wanted to make sure that I kept it lean. The conspiracy can be broad, but the people who are actually doing it, you get lost if you have too many players